Qing's novella Beauty on the Crossroad. Original text 12. The noble family is like the sea. After leaving Qing, I took my daughter and I rented a small room in an apartment in the West District. Of course, I was looking for a job at that time. I was busy running around here and there for almost half a month, but I still had no idea. One day, I suddenly received an invitation. It's Zhu Aiyu, an old classmate of my sister's. She is getting married. I clearly remember that Zhu Aiyu was a responsible girl. Just like my sisters, they studied hard in school and worked seriously in society. My sister is now in the mainland. I heard that she is already working as a teaching assistant at Capital University, but she is working in Shanghai. She is a helpless and lonely woman. She must be in her 30s this year, right? He actually found his home. Of course, I had to rush to say congratulations and immediately brought a congratulatory gift. The auditorium is located on the 8th floor of the bank club. The groom is a well-established figure in the banking industry. The scene is quite luxurious. I can't help but secretly feel happy for Zhu Aiyu. When we arrived at the auditorium, we saw flowers all filled with congratulatory guests. I arrived a little late, and they were already saluting. One bow. To bows, I looked out from the crowd and saw only the groom's slumped head. I couldn't help but laugh. Later, the bride and groom thanked their guests, and they both turned around. Only then did I get a clear look at the groom's plump, round face, which was already haggard, but suddenly exposed to the rain and dew, and seemed to be coming back to life. Flower seller. Alas, a 60-year-old man begged a 30-year-old woman to fill in his house after his wife died. This is still called a good story. What if a 60-year-old woman died and her husband wanted to remarry? Not to mention that absolutely no one would want her. Even if there was a chance, wouldn't it become a joke and a scandal? It's pitiful that Zhu Aiyu sacrificed his pure virgin body to such a dying old man, but he still smiled and thought he had a destination. Yes, she would go home and sleep with this bald old man tonight, and it would be unimaginably dirty and uncomfortable. Later I asked her, "How is Mr.?" She blushed and replied, He is very energetic. I actually find it annoying. That's what marriage is like. I have to fight." The old gentleman walked around the famous Du Mansion. So Zhu Aiyu took me to play in the Du Mansion once. It was 11:30 a.m. when we went. It was quiet in the Du Mansion, and some people did not look like the lively people with wealth and power. When I looked at it, I actually liked it. The servant led us into a small living room and gently apologized to Zhu Aiyu. "My wife is getting up soon. Please sit down for a while." Only then did I understand that his family members had not gotten up yet. Round 12:15, someone came to invite us upstairs. When we got to the sitting room above, we saw a middle-aged woman with unkempt hair and embroidered pajamas lying on the stove. She only bowed slightly when she saw us, but Zhu Aiyu was already ready to smile. She introduced me. "This is Mrs. Du." After that, she pointed at me and told her, "This is Miss Zhang." Mrs. Du nodded casually. The servant came up very respectfully and asked the wife to drink milk and have breakfast. Mrs. Du said to us politely, "You too, please come and have some breakfast." Zhu Aiyu replied, "We have already eaten." I thought to myself, it should be said that we have already eaten. Mrs. Du yawned, stopped being polite, and slowly started to sip the milk by herself. After a while, she suddenly remembered something and asked Zhu Aiyu, "Last time I asked you to find a tutor for our country. How are you doing now?" Zhu Aiyu quickly apologized and said with a smile, "Yes, I do too. I've been paying attention. The house is no different from others, and careless people are not allowed." This Miss Zhang has recently separated from her husband. I almost burrowed into the ground while listening. I feel really embarrassed to do things like this in front of others. Mrs. Du gave me a stern look and asked, "Why did you leave your husband?" I felt sad because I believe that in ordinary people's imagination, women who divorce their husbands are either too ugly in appearance or have poor behavior. Romance doesn't exist in our room. Unfortunately, I'm not one of those ugly people, so I will be considered romantic by them. How can I explain myself? Seeing that I was hesitant and silent, Zhu Aiyu answered on my behalf. Her husband is not upright. So, Mrs. Du immediately interrupted and said, "You have to persuade him even if you don't do things, right? The man's lack of motivation depends entirely on your skill as a woman. Have you ever seen how I persuaded our Mr. Du to come? Zhu Yu smiled apologetically and said, how can she compare with you, Mrs. Du? And her husband cannot be compared with Mr. Du. Mr. Du is a man of social status and naturally loves face, but he, Miss Jiang's husband, is if you say a few words to him, he will just ignore you and won't even give you pocket money to buy side dishes. Mrs. Du said angrily, how can this be allowed? As the saying goes, a couple with daily necessities is a friend of wine and meat. It means that when a friend comes to your house, you must entertain him with good wine and meat, and you must not be rude. As for the husband and wife, naturally, the husband must give some rice money to his wife, and then the wife will faithfully support her husband. Miss Zhang, you have to ask for it. I thought to myself, who hasn't asked him for help? But what can we do if we can't get it out? Now that Li has left, what else is there to say? Zhu Yu also knew that he couldn't explain it clearly to her, so he changed the subject and said, didn't Mrs. Du want me to find a tutor? What do you think of this young lady? Mrs. Du put down the milk glass, looked at me carefully, and then smiled slightly and said, Miss Zhang is quite honest. Okay, I'll give you a reply after I discuss it with Mr. Du. I just thought it was an insult, an embarrassing insult. But in the end I still joined because his salary was good and I couldn't find other jobs. It was dusk when we entered, and cars were filing in on the walkway next to the garden, all driving slowly, like shell insects crawling. The entire large bungalow was like a volcano emitting dazzling lights, and the surrounding garden was as bright as a star belt. Only then did I appreciate the luxury of the wealthy family, which was very different from the deserted situation last time. Mrs. Du was dressed radiantly and sitting at the card table. There were a lot of female guests surrounding her. The jewels and embroidery were so splendid that it was unstoppable. I deeply regretted that I should not have come here. Thinking of my simple clothes, I couldn't help but feel it's shameful to live in poverty. So I stood beside Mrs. Du uneasily, not knowing what to say. Ms. Zhang, can you knit woolen sweaters? She asked casually. Not much. Can you embroider? No, at this time. She suddenly clapped her hands and laughed. It turned out that she had got a good deck of cards. I didn't dare to disturb her, so I just stood aside and watched quietly, thinking to myself, are you asking me to be your tutor? Or do you want me to be your superior aunt? Before I could finish thinking about it, I saw her dancing and taking in a lot of chips. Seeing me standing beside me blankly, she smiled and comforted me and said, it doesn't matter, please sit down. Although my family is not rich, but I won't leave you alone. Please stay wherever you want. Just ask the errand for whatever you want. I felt very uneasy, as if I was living here for free. After a while, Mr. Du sent someone to invite me over. He was sitting in the study, with many guests beside him. He smoked cigars, and his hair was a little gray, but he was still full of energy and had a solemn attitude. I was timid and didn't dare to move forward. Everyone's eyes were on me, and I was so anxious that I almost wanted to cry. Is this Miss Zhang? He said gently, please sit down. He looked like a loving father caressing his frightened child. I felt relieved to sit next to him. My girl is weak and has average qualifications. I hope you can teach her well. He put down his cigar and said slowly. I felt my face was getting hot, and I thought I might as well say something polite, saying that your daughter was born with intelligence. But after all I couldn't speak, so I lowered my head and heard Mr. Du chuckle and say, you're still just a kid. It's very naive. It probably refers to me. I feel embarrassed, but on the other hand, it also feels very useful. Do you have children yourself? He asked again. Yes, I have my 2 daughters with me. Are there any boys? There is one too, but their family refuses to give it to me. Mr. Du suddenly sighed and said, it is very unfortunate for a couple to leave, especially for women and children. In fact, it is better not to take your 2 girls out. You can find a home quickly if you are free by yourself. Returning home, I thought of the bald old man Zhu Yu, and couldn't help but laugh to myself. Mr. Du seemed to have misunderstood what I meant, thinking that he had guessed what I was thinking. So he said to me, is what I said correct? A woman's destiny is to marry a man, and finding a career is unreliable. Miss Zhang, you don't have to worry. Most of the people I visit here are celebrities. I will be a good matchmaker for you in the future. Everyone laughed, and I couldn't sit still anymore, so I had to pretend to be embarrassed. run out. Radio singing and laughter were everywhere, and I felt that it was already a peaceful and prosperous age, so people could enjoy themselves without any worries. The noble family was like a sea, as if they were completely isolated from the entire world of suffering.
All right, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.